All right, chapter 12, school desegregation. If this goes on. Okay. So starting with defining the term, de jure segregation is segregation as sanctioned by law, as was in the case in Brown. Because the Equal Protection Clause essentially covers state action, it prohibits state endorsed discrimination. So, as we all know, school segregation exists in the school system until 1960s. Um, Boards had adopted the idea separate but equal. So the idea is kind of reinforced through Supreme Court cases out of Louisiana, including Plessy versus Ferguson. And this established a legal basis for segregating public facilities. Legal separation of people by enforcing laws would just be de jure segregation. In each case, or because of this, you have Brown versus Board of Education. This results in kind of four cases separately, but all addressing something similar. So they're consolidated and they decide in Brown. Each case, Black students sought admission to segregated schools in their communities, all for different reasons. The four cases believe that they were a violation of the Equal Protection Clause granted in the 14th Amendment due to the fact that schools could not be made equal with separate facilities. So, due to the fact that facilities weren't equal, the idea of separate but equal didn't actually exist. It was just an idea. So, in these cases, in the three states of South Carolina, Virginia, and Delaware, they all had statutes that called for segregated schools. Kansas permitted but did not require segregated schools. So the four states relied on the separate but equal decision, as I just said. The U.S. Supreme Court disagreed and held for the students. They argued that students cannot be discriminated against in their attempts to attend school on the basis of race. So the 14th Amendment guarantees these equal protection under the law for schools attending public schools. So it's always a question of if we have the Emancipation Proclamation in the 1860s, how do we go almost 100 years without desegregating the schools? And this is how, based under Plessy versus Ferguson, you have that separate but equal clause, which is kind of what was keeping schools segregated at the time. Segregated or segregation sanctioned by a state deprives minority children of equal educational opportunities. So separate but equal schools based on race are inherently unequal and unconstitutional. So these are the grounds that they go under for Brown versus Board of Education. This does change segregation in schools to a place where now they're going to be desegregated, but it was following the Brown versus Board of Education case where things got a little complicated. The implementation of Brown versus Board was maybe you could say lackluster. Since the ruling proved no real guidance or officially mandated time frame to achieve, it kind of you might argue failed. The wording was just to converge at all deliberate speed. So this left too much disparity in understanding or interpreting that. And among districts, the implementation was completely different. So Brown versus Board Education second time around, ruling was fashioned to ensure proper implementation of what was Brown versus Board first time around. And so these cases were remanded to federal district courts based on proximity to local school districts. The idea was we can't see everything that's happening within that community at too far of a level. So if we go to district, now we can see the proximity and we're able to address these rulings or these issues one by one. The ruling mandated that school authorities be delegated the authority to implement its ruling in good faith and with all deliberate speed once again. What was interesting, the Supreme Court justice who spoke on Brown v. Board of Education round two mentioned that, if I can find it again, basically just said Brown v. Board was an example of trial and error because there were so many things they didn't consider or weren't aware of. It was just in systems of trial and error until they got what was right. So the ruling in Brown v. Board 2 was handed down as a means of expediting the ruling in Brown v. Board 1. It remanded desegregation cases to federal district courts because of their close proximity, like was mentioned earlier. And so the idea was they need to implement and speed up this process. Schwann versus Charlotte Mecklenburg Board of Education. Schwann was a leading case in defining the scope of the duty to eliminate this type of segregation and, more importantly, get rid of the dual school system. So the way that southern states were kind of keeping it segregated was they went with the dual school systems, stating that it was equal. They didn't need to desegregate. So the objective in Schwann was that they're going to ensure that school authorities excluded no student of a racial minority from any school directly or indirectly based on race. A couple of ways they went about this. They used mathematical ratios as a starting point in the process of shaping a remedy for eradicating segregated schools. In the text, it mentions the racial balance requirement was 71% to 29% in individual schools. If an optional majority to minority transfer provision is implemented, transferring students must be granted free transportation. So that was another thing. I think you'll talk about that a little more in busing. I think that's down there later.
It is.
Yes. Another adjustment was the pairing and grouping for school zones is a permissible tool and should be considered in light of the objectives sought by the school district. And then finally, part of Schwann was an objective to transportation of students may be valid when the time and distance of travel is so great as to either risk the health of children or significantly impinge on the educational process. So essentially what Brown v. Board 1 and 2 taught us is when you're making a major change like this, there's going to be systems of trial and error as far as politics go, but trying to keep these laws regulated at a closer level, closer to the districts and under the administrative's authority is going to yield better, faster results.
Okay, so busing and desegregation. Historically, the courts have viewed busing as an effective means of achieving desegregated schools, which means that the courts saw busing as a useful way to help end racial segregation in schools and ensure that students of different races could attend schools together. It has met opposition by parents and taxpayers who considered busing to be a threat to the neighborhood school concept. It was time consuming for students and added expense on taxpayers. So parents and taxpayers advocated that money be expended on improving neighborhood schools rather than spending it on busing. And several states passed anti-busing legislation to prohibit the use of busing. A number of district courts concluded that allowing students to attend schools near where they lived would not effectively dismantle dual school systems. So busing is considered one viable measure used by the courts to achieve desegregated schools. De facto segregation is present when a substantial number of students enrolled in a school represent a racial and ethnic minority. This situation developed through no action taken by the school district. So it isn't because the school district purposely created separated schools. Instead, it happens because of factors where I'm on Zoom. Sorry. Factors like where people live, social or economic conditions, or other outside influences without the school taking any specific action to separate schools or students. According to the text, this actually happened in New York. Many minority students ended up in separate schools, not because of laws, but because of where people lived. So housing patterns cause racial and ethnic groups to be divided, leading to the schools with mostly white or minority students. And the situation looked like segregation, even though it wasn't caused by official policies. And that is known as false de facto segregation. The courts did, however, mandate that corrective action be taken in instances where school officials gerrymander or altered school attendance zones to create zones with large concentrations of Black students assigned to historically Black schools within the district. District courts may alter attendance zones and may devise zones based on grouping and pairing schools and may require busing to achieve desegregation. District courts may disallow patterns of school construction and abandonment that create a dual system of education. Plans devised that result in substantially segregated schools are illegal. Conduct on the part of the school board that is designed to create and maintain segregated schools clearly violates the 14th Amendment and the Brown holding. Um,
I will say on that,
Go ahead.
have you seen the movie The Best of Enemies?
No, I haven't.
That is a must watch. It is about a school board in, I want to say, Louisiana. True story, North Carolina. And it's about school integration in 1971 and basically a civil rights activist versus uh, Ku Klux Klan member. And for a while, they talk about like the desegregation of their school and really good movie, The Best of Enemies. True story about two people who successfully desegregated a school in North Carolina who were exact opposites, a civil rights activist and a Ku Klux Klan leader. And by the end of it, had merged their school systems.
What'd you say it was called?
The Best of Enemies.
The best.
And it has, if you know, Ann Atwater.
No.
Um, she, she's pretty popular, but she does a great job. She's in like The Help, if you've seen The Help or anything like that.
I haven't. Okay, seeking unitary status. School districts across the nation have filed for unitary status. When school districts file for unitary status, they're asking the court to say they successfully integrated their schools and no longer need special rules to prevent segregation. They have essentially made the claim that they have operated in good faith, and based on these efforts, they are requesting that they be relieved of court supervision. Achieving unitary status in some areas may lead to relinquished judicial control, even when some other areas have not achieved unitary status. In the text, it stated that the Board of Education of Oklahoma City Public Schools versus Dowell case in 1972 involved the issue of whether a school district could be released from court supervision after it had been ordered to desegregate. The Supreme Court ruled that if a district had made enough progress integrating its schools, it could be granted unitary status and no longer be under the court supervision. In this case, Oklahoma City Public Schools had made efforts to integrate, and the court decided that the district had complied enough with desegregation orders to end federal oversight. And through relinquishing control in areas deemed to be unitary, a school district may effectively focus on the areas in need of further attention.